Poland is influencing the European Union to act against Russia, and the Molotov Ribbentrop Pact was a deal between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany to unite Europe and bring about everlasting peace. Well, maybe not, because this is StopFake, the place where we've been conducting truth autopsies on this kind of Russian disinformation for 5 years now. So let's get to it. The Kremlin's disinformation factory was working overtime last week. They were pushing a narrative that Poland has agreed to the deployment of additional US troops on its territory because of old historic scores Poland has to settle with Germany. RT declared that Warsaw is looking to increase its influence in Eastern Europe and is resorting to fairy tales about Russian aggression that, according to RT, even Poles don't believe, while RIA Novosti accused Poland of indulging the whims of its American masters by intensifying military threats in Europe because, of course, the Americans are a military threat, a classic favorite theme in Russian disinformation, and RIA goes on to blame the Poles for spreading Russophobia. The recent wave of Russian negative press about Poland began in June of this year when Polish President Andrzej Duda visited Washington, where he signed a joint declaration on defense cooperation with President Donald Trump. Russian anger grew when Polish Foreign Minister Jacek Czaputowicz announced that the presence of U.S. military on Polish soil was an important deterrent and should prevent any aggressive actions on the part of Russia. Quote, Russia will think twice before using military force if they see the presence of foreign troops, particularly American ones, Czaputowicz said. He went on to note that these American troops will strengthen Poland's and Europe's common defense and act as a deterrent against an aggressive Russia. Poland has no ambitions to increase its influence in Europe, and unlike Russia, who invaded and occupied Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and then again invaded and occupied eastern Donbass, Poland has not invaded anyone. Poland is seeking greater security by expanding the contingent of U.S. troops on its territory in response to Russia's aggression, something any rational actor would want to do. Czaputowicz stressed that NATO's main defense force would still remain in Germany, and the contingent deployed in Poland will be much smaller than the 35,000 U.S. troops based in Germany. In an interview with the Polish national newspaper Rzeczpospolita, Czaputowicz said the decision to increase the military presence in Poland and the Baltic countries was taken at a NATO summit 3 years ago in response to Russia's seizure of Ukrainian territories. The Russian propagandist media claimed that this was a singular Polish initiative is raw disinformation because the decision to increase U.S. troops in Poland was a collective NATO decision in response to Russian aggression. August 23rd is the 80th anniversary of the infamous Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that divided Europe into Soviet and Nazi spheres of influence and ultimately led to World War II and all the resulting tragic consequences. The day the pact was signed, the 23rd of August, is observed as a day of remembrance for victims of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 10 European countries, the US, Canada, and Georgia. In fact, it's called Black Ribbon Day. The pact was officially called the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and just 1 week after it was signed, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. 2 weeks later, following the terms of the pact, Soviet troops also invaded Poland. Our colleagues at EU vs. Disinfo have called the Russian interpretation of the pact and its aftermath a very serious, egregious act of disinformation. Now, how is that possible? Well, pro-Kremlin media is adamant in pushing the following narratives: that the USSR was reluctant to sign the pact, that the Soviet Union had no other choice, that the pact did not trigger World War II, that the USSR cannot be blamed for it, and Poland wanted to attack the USSR, or finally, that all of it was Hitler's idea anyway. And this one is the first rule in Russia's disinformation playbook. We had nothing to do with it, and then devote resources to get you to believe it. So, is it really the case that the Soviet Union had nothing to do with the deal they signed with Nazi Germany? Well, Professor Lubomir Luciuk of the Royal Military College in Canada wrote in the Kingston Whig Standard, quote, "This pact succored the German war effort, undercutting Britain's blockade. 1 million tons of cereal, 500,000 tons of wheat, 900,000 tons of oil, 100,000 tons of cotton, 500,000 tons of phosphates, 1 million tons of soybeans, and other materiel were shipped to the Nazis by the Soviets during the pact's first year. And after Nazi Germany signed the tripartite pact with Imperial Japan and Mussolini's fascist Italy in September 1940, the Soviets considered joining a continental bloc opposed to Britain and the United States. The memory of the Soviet Union has to be recollected in a positive, even Pollyanna way, even though, as Lubomir Litsuk wrote, we must never forget that Moscow's men not only fueled the Second World War, but joined our side, the Allies, only after the Holocaust they had stoked began to burn their empire down. Clearly, the Soviet Union was allied with Nazi Germany. But how did we go from Soviet collaboration with Nazis to Soviet liberators over Nazis? Well, the myth of Soviet heroism is an industry in Russia, a big industry, with historians, conferences, novels, documentaries, and action movies that have been in production for decades. And anyone who presents reality based on archival evidence that questions this myth is relentlessly attacked by pro-Kremlin media and those who believe in this disinformation. For example, earlier this summer, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania summoned representatives from Russia's embassies to protest the display of fireworks celebrating when the Red Army captured the capital cities of the Baltic states. In response, Kremlin media blamed the Baltic states of perpetuating the myth of Soviet occupation and refusing to celebrate victory over fascism, and then they turn on their righteous indignation machine, just like the fake laugh tracks from sitcoms, trying to shame the Baltic states by labeling them ungrateful and even accusing Latvia of psychiatric Russophobia and historical revisionism. Look, it should be clear that defeating Nazi Germany undoubtedly was one of the most important moments in European history. But to portray the Red Army's advance into Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe as a liberation is probably the most glaring disinformation case to date. The myth of Soviet occupation as liberation also enables pro-Kremlin disinformation to portray those who do not glorify the Soviet Union and reject the idea of being part of Moscow's sphere of influence as Russophobes or fascists who suffer from a distorted historical memory. Simply put, when someone uses the term Soviet occupation, Russian media or the useful idiots will equate that with being a neo-Nazi. But why invest so much into maintaining the myth of Soviet occupation as liberation? Why would the Kremlin disinformation network distribute this myth for so long? Why continue to paint Ukrainians as Nazi collaborators, Ukrainians who fought against both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia? Why not have a time for atonement? That is, come to terms with the truth, no matter how complicated or uncomfortable it may be. Well, the simple answer is that it's like criminal behavior. When a criminal commits a crime, the first thing they do is to try and cover it up. Most importantly, the myth of Soviet occupation as liberation is done to erase from memory the mass repressions and suffering of millions of different people in different countries, including Russians, at the hands of the Soviet regime. The complicated answer to why invest in this grand lie is because fake news can lead to fake memories, which is the title of an article in the Association for Psychological Science about a research paper that looked into false memories and fake news. When people are exposed to fabricated stories in the news, there's evidence that suggests people in turn will develop false memories. Gillian Murphy, the lead researcher, was studying the impact of fake news on the 2018 Irish abortion referendum. One of the co-authors, Elizabeth Loftus from the University of California at Irvine, said, quote, "People will act on their fake memories, and it is often hard to convince them that fake news is fake. It should come as no surprise, then, that when people were told that Nazis had taken over Kyiv, that they would welcome the Russian occupation of Crimea and the Donbass because they've been told that occupation is liberation for over 50 years. But sometimes the reliable disinformation narratives of fascism and Russophobia don't work. And then Russian disinformation turns to the narrative the evil West or the evil Americans or warmongering NATO is behind it all. So when Russians protesting in the streets of Moscow can't be labeled as either fascists or Russophobes, the media ecosystem gets flooded with the West is behind it conspiracies. Pro-Kremlin media are claiming this week that George Soros and the West have been financing and instructing the Russian opposition, stirring up demonstrations, of course, with the help of the European Court of Human Rights. And at the same time, Britain and the United States were blamed for orchestrating the protests in Hong Kong. Get used to living in this Orwellian disinformation world, one where a totalitarian occupation regime is hailed as a liberator. In this world, there's almost no capacity to recognize that individuals can fight for their liberties. But fight they do. And they take inspiration from those who have fought before them, like the Hong Kong protesters who cited Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution as motivation, and are now planning to stage a local version of the human chain that took place across the Baltic states on August the 23rd, 1989, a symbolic act of resistance from 30 years ago that helped bring down the Soviet Union. That's it for this week. There's much more dissected disinformation on the StopFake website. Be vigilant, look out for fakes, and if you spot any disinformation about Ukraine, forward it to us for a truth autopsy. I'm Marko Suprun, and this is StopFake. Thanks for watching.